welcome to the 321 podcast. I'm Jacob Shevchik, and today's guest is the first known specialist substitutions coach in the history of the beautiful game, Sammy Lander. Welcome, Sammy. Thank you for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks for the invite. I'm really happy to be here and chat some football.
Fantastic. Let's start with a very obvious question. How did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, so it's been a really funny journey, and probably one that not many of your listeners might have taken before. But it's so I started obviously in football. I lost sight in my right eye, so it meant playing was never really an option. So I was like, what option can I take in order to sort of stay in football and be involved in your passion? So I looked into coaching and scouting, recruitment analysts, that sort of thing, and I managed to get a job as a scout, as an intern at Brentford, and then managed to get another job as a scout at Bournemouth. Sort of worked my way up there, managed to get to under 23s, met a non-league manager, sort of managed to work my way into being a football coach there, and it was only there that I've sort of experienced proper first team football, which is something that I've experienced. I can't go back from. I like playing to win. And then from Weymouth, I sort of developed this concept, pitched it to Wimbledon, and that was my most recent year as sub coach at Wimbledon, like you said. I can't quite hear you, Jacob. You've gone silent, unfortunately.
Sorry, I didn't turn my mute.
No worries.
Just a follow-up question: was playing on the cards for you before your eye injury? So did you have the quality to play professional football before you were interested in recruitment?
No. I'll tell everyone I did, and that I was an amazing number 10, and that would link the play in the half spaces. But the reality is, I never quite had the technical ability in order to push as a pro.
Yeah, that's the same situation I think with many of us who are interested in football recruitment. That we'd like to stay in the beautiful game in some capacity, but we don't have the quality to be on the pitch, unfortunately. But you started your career as a scout. Why did you switch gears to become a substitutions coach?
Yeah, so I love recruitment, and it's something I've always had a passion for. And like I say, it was my first role, so it was something that did interest me. But I think for me, being on the grass as a coach, there's nothing like it. You know, being in and around the players and designing these sessions that can get these outcomes that you want. That for me is the ultimate goal, and something that I really get a buzz off. And why the subs coach is because I think it's so hard nowadays for people to break into football and get a full-time job in football. I think it's one of the hardest things. So I almost had to try and find something that clubs didn't have, you know, and make myself employable to them and make myself a niche. And obviously there are probably hundreds and millions of scouts out there already that can do what I do, whereas as a subs coach, I was the only person offering that. So it meant, you know, that I sort of had an advantage to go and offer myself to clubs that would find me of use.
Yeah, I admire that massively, because what you've essentially done is you've created a position for yourself. You've carved out a niche for yourself, and you've managed to, through sheer innovation, you've managed to forge yourself a career in football, which is quite spectacular, if I might.
Thank you.
It's very rare, because most people aren't quite as creative, and they'll go into recruitment, they'll go into scouting or coaching or something standard. But you've went your own way. But I don't know if you're aware of this, but around 7 months ago, a brilliant YouTube channel called Tifo Football released a video titled "Wimbledon Have a Substitutes Coach." I watched this video around 7 months ago when it came out, and I was fascinated by it. And I couldn't remember the name of the coach. And it turns out that the coach mentioned is yourself, Sammy Lander.
Yeah.
Are you aware of this video? Have you watched it?
Yeah, so that video was created off The Athletic. I think there's a partnership there in some capacity.
Yeah.
But The Athletic came in and did an interview on Wimbledon because we were doing things a little bit differently with a set piece coach and a mindset coach. And Ben Ryan was in the area as well. So they came in to do a piece on sort of how we were doing things maybe a little bit differently to sort of other League One teams. Um, so yeah, the video got made off the back of that interview and was sent to me, and it's probably one of my proudest moments, to be fair, because I'm a massive fan of the Tifo videos, and I'm always watching their latest videos that are coming out. So to actually feature in one was yeah, it was a really nice surprise. But yeah, I think it summarises the role quite nicely as well, because I think a lot of people get a little bit skeptical about the role of a substitutes coach. I think a lot of people I speak to think it's merely sort of just asking players to go and warm up at 30 minutes and at 60 minutes, whereas this video, in a really nice, brief and creative way, summarises maybe a little bit more of the layers to the role than what people first think there is.
Yeah, the video itself is quite. It's really really good. I recommend anyone who hasn't seen the video. Of course, after you've finished listening to this fantastic podcast, I'd suggest that you watch this video. When Wimbledon have a substitutes coach on YouTube by Tifo Football, it's really really fantastic, and it does, like you said, go into great detail. And thanks to that video, I have a layman's understanding of your role. I think I do anyway. It's kind of I think it's to prepare substitutes to come on and make a more immediate impact on the match, and to essentially make every sub a super sub in a way. Is that accurate? And how would you describe your role?
Yeah, so I think my role is quite, it can be quite complex, but I think if you break it down, you go, like you said, it's to make sure that every substitution is coming off the bench, ensuring that they feel prepared to go and positively impact the game of football in every corner, in every corner of their of them, really, in terms of the social, the technical, the tactical, the psychological, the physical. Because I think so often, I'll just pick one example where you probably look at physically. How often do you see players go down touch lines and just drop to one knee, talk to their mate who's on the opposition side for a little bit, maybe open the gates, jog back, get the bench coat back on, and start snacking on the jelly beans. And it's like, if you started that, you'd question where their head was at. So, yeah, my role is to ensure that them standards are being met for substitutes as well, because the whole role for me has been sort of triggered by the fact that I think substitutions have been underperforming for years. When you get three players to enter a game of football, for them to potentially not really register anything technically and to not run as much as the player who they're replacing and so on, I think is a real disservice to a substitute. So yeah, my role is to ensure that those standards are being met and that players are feeling ready.
You mentioned three substitutes just there, but from well, in some leagues there will now be five substitutions, so that will make your job somewhat harder.
Yeah, I think I had a chat about someone else, sorry, about this the other day, and I think it's a really interesting perspective. I think it will benefit me in my role. I think because at the moment substitutes can go under the radar a little bit, because you can potentially have up to 8 starters who are still in the game, in the rhythm, in the flow, making things work, and the three substitutes that enter the game potentially don't need to have an impact because they're still 8 players that are performing at a high role. Whereas now it's up to 5. Now you're potentially saying you can substitute half of the starting 10. If you take away the keeper, the 10 outfields. So I think substitutes are now going to become into the spotlight a lot more about what they actually contribute to a game of football. So I think it'll be really interesting to see now, and I hopefully, yeah, my role will now become in a little bit more of demand, because there's the margin now, or the impact that substitutes can have on the game has now got bigger.
I agree. I completely agree. The margins are now bigger. The opportunity is there to really change a game with five substitutes because you're switching out essentially half the team, so you
Hmm.
can really really make an impact. But when we first spoke, you mentioned something very interesting that I've never thought of before. Earlier, you said about the physical aspect, and that's the only aspect I've ever thought of, and I assume most people have ever thought of when it comes to preparing substitutes to come on the pitch and make an impact. Because you, like you said, you see the players warming up. They're doing their fake stretches, they're just chatting to their mates, and overall just taking a most people take a generally relaxed approach to that. And but you told me that your job is ensuring a warm up in every model of the and ensuring a warm up in every corner of the FA model, not just in the physical way. Uh, Talk us through a comprehensive four corner preparation for a substitute, if you can.
Yeah, of course. So obviously we touched on the physical, but psychologically is you could argue even more important, because if players, you can get a player as ready as they'll ever be, technically, tactically, physically, but if they don't feel 100% and don't feel confident or and wanted and loved, then they're not going to execute what you've talked about or what you've practiced. So, a psychological warm up might just be the fact that you're talking the player through the games in order to know their roles and responsibilities. It might be ensuring that the player knows that they've still got a role to play in that game day. Because players, or the experience that I've had, players think that if they're not starting, then they're maybe not important. So it's about sort of changing that angle and changing that perspective for them to realise that we had a player at Wimbledon last year, a centre back, who was fantastic. So obviously centre backs are probably one of the least changed positions. So he would be a finisher with me quite a lot, and he would sort of help me at half time, run the half time. So he'd warm up the wingers, he'd warm up the strikers, by 1v1 in them, by letting them pin him, and I've got footage of him helping a winger warm up. That winger comes on to score from a corner, in a movement that they practiced, and his involvement and contribution is just as important as anyone else in that game day. And it's helping players realise that, and that's done through the psychological sort of like making sure they feel appreciated, and that for me is what I've called the warm up. Another example would be sort of like the technical warm up. So how often do you see players at half time just ping diags for 15 minutes of a half time, unopposed, 25 yards, but when they come on, they won't perform that movement once. So it's about making sure that technically they feel warm. So when you get into rondos, passing diamonds, they're checking their shoulder, they're coming to double movement, they're hitting the back foot, they're knowing back foot, front foot combination. It's just those little things that you can enforce so that they become instinct and habits and patterns, so that when they come on the game of football, they're not having to think about it. They just come in and they're free flowing, and the impact is then from minute one. And then tactically is just knowing the shape and the pressing shape and the roles and responsibilities within that shape. But yeah, it's interesting because obviously the four corner model is something that I was introduced to when I was doing my coaching qualifications. So it's just sort of something I've applied to ensure that players are feeling ready, really, because being a substitute, I think, is so difficult.
Definitely, and I think you mentioned the term finisher just there. I think mentioned it quite a few times in the article, because in the TIFO video, there's a lot of use of the word finisher. And what do you mean by finisher? And would I be right in assuming that that's kind of part of the psychological and mental warm up? So the players, they feel valued, and they feel like, okay, I'm not just on the bench because I'm a bad player or I perform badly. It's because I can be brought on later to make an impact on the match.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the term finish is obviously quite commonly known or associated with Eddie Jones from England rugby, and if I'm honest, he was probably one of my inspirations as well as someone who that's who I got the phrase from. But at Wimbledon, we took it a little bit further, and we designed, I think it was up to 11 names, um, that we would call our finishers, each with a different role almost. So just one example is the other one we would use is energizer. So an energizer would be players that would have to come on and bring an increased level of energy to the starters who had potentially got a little bit flat, needed that momentum, needed that energy to come on, needed that lift. Um, there's loads of names that you can call them, because at the end of the day, being a substitute is quite a negative term. It's quite it's not empowering, which is what we want to do to our players. We want our players to feel confident, and the term substitute, I think, if you look at the definition, it means almost second best. And that's not how we want our players to feel, because that's not how you get match winners. If you have a player that feels like that, you need a player to feel empowered and have that growth mindset and have that confidence sort of coming out of them. So yeah, finisher is one of the terms we use. Energizer is another, and we use sort of a few others.
Okay, I'm guessing that a normal day, shall we say, in the office is very different to a match day. What does a training day look like for you? And what do you do, for example, on a day-to-day basis? And what does a film actually look like for you? Because I don't think, because obviously we've explained the parts of your role during 90 minutes or during, let's say, 180 minutes, where your job is to prepare the substitutes to come on and make an impact. But what do you do on a day to day basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my role, particularly at Wimbledon, was a little bit different because I was only part time there. So um, I wasn't in all of the time. So when I was in, it would be a case of collecting the data that we used in order to influence our substitutions and to ensure that the substitutions were having the impact that we thought, and sort of cross-referencing that with the data. And also, it would just be being in and around the players, being in and around training, because it's so important for me to know exactly what the gaffer's thinking, and knowing the pressing shape, and things like that. Because if a player comes on, I need to be able to know what the triggers to press are, what the set piece roles are for those players. So we had a set piece coach, so being involved in his session and just observing it. Uh, and probably most importantly is just observing the players, because that's how you get to know how a player is feeling, by observing them. So I would go into training and observe, the body language of a player, the interactions I would have with a player, and from that you could sort of gauge whether they're feeling potentially a little bit disappointed, a little bit demotivated, a little bit upset with the current, minutes that he's getting. And so it's just a case now of being supportive and being in and around them, to be a little bit positive and be that energy that keeps them going, and chatting with them. So as much as I would have loved to be involved directly in the coaching and delivering technicals, in which I helped out with a little bit, it was more to be in and around the lads, in order to ensure that I knew everything tactically and technically. So when we went into a game day, it was a smooth transition.
You just mentioned data there. How much of a role does data play in your job?
Yeah, so I mean, it's dependent on the gaffer at the end of the day, because some people can be very data driven. Some people can be a little bit skeptical of it. At Wimbledon, we tended to use the data because it suggested patterns for players. So the data we used would be able to sort of influence, or not influence, but inform the gaffer of the substitutes that we had on the bench, and the strengths and weaknesses of those players. So, for example, we had a player who was clearly one of the best 1v1 players in the squad from his KPI. He averaged a successful 1v1 every 7 minutes that he played. So by having that on the bench, and by having that data, we know that every 7 minutes that we give this player, the probability suggests that he'll produce a 1v1. Now, 1v1 might not be the most useful KPI that I've used as an example there, but we had several KPIs that you could relate to a game, such as a shot on target or a chance created. So that sort of data allowed us to be a little bit more deliberate with our substitutions, and in turn, resulted in more effective substitutions.
Speaking of skeptics, as in every walk of life, there are also skeptics in football. Some people in executive positions who just want to maintain the status quo and not innovate. I describe your role as innovative. So some people wouldn't hire a substitution coach. How would you sell the idea of a substitutions coach to an unconvinced decision maker?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it is a little bit, like I say, most people I message first time round on LinkedIn or email are a little bit cautious of the role. And it's a shame that it's like that, because I feel like sometimes in football, when something's new, it's almost seen to be crazy. I think it was Bielsa that said everything is crazy until it's proven, or something like that. So, and it's very much the same with this role, and I wouldn't expect anything other, because it is so brand new. Um, but all I would say is that football is such fine margins. It's a cruel sport. You can dominate a game for 90 minutes and still lose. It's such a unique sport, the way that it's played out like that. And I think marginal gains and the extra 1% in football are now starting to make the difference. Um, because there's so many external factors. And typically, teams that I've worked for will be teams that have smaller budgets. So Weymouth, we were the one of the only part-time teams in a full-time league. Wimbledon had one of the smallest budgets in the league. So we're coming up against massive teams who potentially have more resources than us, and this role allows us to just level that playing ground a little bit, and allows us to sort of be a little bit more on par with the teams that we're playing because we don't have the fortune of having the same resources as them. So yeah, and ultimately, I'm so grateful to Wimbledon and particularly to Mark Robinson for giving me the chance because he's allowed me to get a year's worth of data, which is effectively a fact. You can't really argue with data. You can perceive it a certain way, but the data suggests that this role is successful. So it's now a case of just making sure I put that data into the right hands and eyes and ears of the people in football and hopefully get another role from it. But yeah, I think the way that football's going, extra 1% can be the difference now. One goal across. I did a presentation recently for a team and they lost 7 games across a season by one goal. Now if you if your substitute comes on and produces 3 goals from those and you turn those 7 losses into 4 losses and gain an extra 3 points, in the high leagues, that could be the difference between receiving, £8 million prize money and, £12 million prize money, which is a huge jump. So I think that's my angle that I sort of use to approach clubs with at the moment.
I think it's a very fair angle. I think there are many clubs and more clubs these days that are innovative, that are willing to take these kinds of risks. Clubs like, for example, Liverpool, that are aware of the marginal gains that can be had in football and exploit these marginal gains at every single possible opportunity. For example, I think Liverpool were one of the first clubs I definitely were the first high profile club to employ a set piece coach. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they did. They're also
Yeah,
they're a club that would definitely would yeah they're a club with appreciate that really appreciate these kinds of things. But
yeah. So they have the sorry to interrupt, Jacob, but they have the throwing coach. So they have Thomas, who's been fantastic with me. He's such a great guy, and he's always on the other end of the phone for me for when I want to pick his brains about what my next step is and how I can approach something. But you're right, he's one of those sort of specialist coaches, around throw-ins. I think he works with quite a few clubs, but you're right, Liverpool are one who have tapped into his sort of knowledge and know-how of quite a particular niche sort of part of the game, and they feel the benefits for it because they. I think it was last year he put someone on his LinkedIn where it's a goal from a throw-in, and that's an extra goal a season, which can make the difference in football.
especially when you're chasing the infinite budget of Manchester City, then that's definitely any little advantage helps. Yeah, I'm aware of Thomas's work, and I think it's absolutely fantastic. Thomas is someone who I'm quite interested in having on the podcast at some point. So I think I'll drop him a message, see if he's interested.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
I think he'd be an equally fantastic guest. But I have a question about the budget because you mentioned that earlier. How do you think your role would change with a bigger one?
So I think the impact that the substitutes would have would potentially maybe get bigger. One example I used last year was when I was at AFC Wimbledon. We were playing Ipswich, and it was 0-0 at half time. And on their bench, they had 100 League One goals on their bench between sort of 4 or 5 attacking players, and in their career. I looked at our bench, and because we had a slightly smaller budget and less resources, we had 15 goals. So you're looking, going, our bench is considerably in a data way, less advantaged than theirs because they've got so much more resources and goals, and they've managed to bring in potentially League One strikers who they can just rest on the bench. So apply that to my role, then the players that I'm working with are potentially a little bit more experienced. So I think the impact could be bigger. Um, but yeah, it's an interesting question. It's probably one, if I'm honest, that I've not thought about before. I think it'd be interesting to see whether there'd be an obvious one. Obviously, my role is just to get the most out of players in a substitute capacity. So it would be interesting to see whether there was much difference or not.
So you mentioned their experience, and I have a question regarding that. So, for example, there are many coaches who exclusively play. For example, I think like Jose Mourinho, he will never sign a player under the age of 27 because he needs to win now, and he needs to have experienced players in every position. He needs to have high quality players in every position. However, there are also players. There are also more. there are other managers who prefer younger players who like to build very fluid systems with young players because they are more malleable. As to, for example, Mourinho, who prefers experienced players. And in regards to your role, who do you think would be better to work with? Who do you prefer to work with? And in your experience, who's been more effective coming on as a bet as a sub? For example, a young player with tons of energy that will maybe listen to more of your tactical instructions, or an older player who has the experience, the know-how, the quality, but however, there's a chance that they've been around the block, they know everything, so they might not listen to you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer really. I don't think one is better than the other. I think the fact that each players have their own strengths means you just have to tailor them to the game. So, for example, if you're potentially playing in a high pressure game, um, where there's a lot more riding on it, and you need someone who's going to have experienced this sort of pressure before, then you might favour the old player. If you're looking and you're 3-0 up and you want someone to get some minutes or experience, or you're looking for someone to play with a little bit of fearlessness and to come on and be exciting, then you might look at the younger player. But I don't think there's ever a right or wrong because, like you just said there, both players have both got their own strengths. So it's about, in my opinion, from my role, it's about matching the player's strength to the game in order to sort of maximise the productivity that player is going to have in the game.
That's a very measured answer. I'm not going to push you for a controversial take, such as if you could only pick one, younger players or experienced pros, what would you pick? That's not this type of podcast. So I'll ask a different question. So for obviously, some players. It happens that during the course of a match, a player who started the game has been playing poorly for 40 minutes, and they scored an own goal, and they've almost conceded another two. Their pass completion percentage is at 23, and they're being beaten in the air by a 4 foot nothing winger.
Yeah.
And so they're taking off. They're taking off at half time. But how would it be your role to talk to the players, to kind of console them, to make them feel like, okay, don't worry, that okay, that it happens, next time will be better? And how would you do that if that is your role?
Yeah, so it wouldn't be my role directly because from experience, I found that most players, regardless of their sort of characteristics or personality, tend to want space after they've been substituted because it is a frustration for a player because they love playing, they love the ball at their feet, and when you get substituted off, you're the guy taking the ball away from their feet. So it's a case of them really having space and time to sort of reflect and build their self awareness around their performance, in order to sort of gauge maybe why this particular game they haven't maybe played to the standards that they would expect of themselves. So my role could be there to support by all means, because that's what I'm there for. And particularly with the other coaches focusing on the game, it would allow me to have that opportunity to go and talk to the player. But my experience is that most players will tend to just favour a little bit of time by themselves to process sort of what's happened, and in due course, whether it be Monday, they come into the office and you would talk through it.
Yeah, that seems very logical. It's nice to know that players are they're human too, and they like to be not to be disturbed when
Absolutely, yeah.
they've performed badly. But I think what you mentioned about kind of analyzing their performance. Do you work with the performance analysis departments at all? Because I think that's something that if that would definitely be of major benefit, because it's something that then you're able to see which players performed well, which players performed badly from an analysis perspective. Or do you do your own analysis?
Yeah, so there's a mixture, obviously because I am the substitutes coach, and the substitutes fall under my sort of remit. I would tend to do the analysis because it takes it off the load of the other analysts. So I would tend to do my own sort of data collection. But I would work with them very closely because, again, just as like you would need to work with the coaches and the nutritionist and the sports scientist and the physio, you need to work with these departments because so often substitutions get overlooked. So how often do you see clips be made for starters, but potentially not be made for substitutes? So it would be a case of sort of my role to go through and ensure that they're being accounted for. But yeah, I worked with all the departments really because it's important that you centralise all of that information that comes with substitutes.
That is great to hear. So you said you work with all departments. Do you also work with the medical department? Because as someone who is quite a fan of the game Football Manager, you get different. It's quite clear. It tells you different levels of injury. So yeah, you can have a yellow injury or you can have a red injury. Sometimes the player is able to continue, so it's just a knock or a bruise or something, and it will come up that player X has a bruised knee, but should be able to run it off. Or some player or it will just come up. Substitution thing will come up automatically, and you have to take this player off. You have no other choice because he's broken his leg or he's torn his Achilles tendon. He's
Mm,
very injured. If he cannot move, never mind play, he'll be taken off. He'll be off to the hospital on a stretcher because he's very injured. So
mm.
do you work in the medical department? And do you play a role in the assessment of players that are injured to see, for example, can they play, or if how injured, if you would know, I mean, how injured, the severity of their injury and how that could impact their time on the pitch. So, for example, do you help? Sorry, I'm trying to word this in a different way.
No,
Um,
I think I've got the gist.
yeah,
Effectively, I wouldn't make any
apologies.
assumptions on the sorts of injuries that those players get. I would work with the medical department and the physios and the sports scientists because very very commonly players who are coming back from injury, will need to have a particular attention on the part of the muscle or whatever injury they might have sort of had. They need to be specific with their warm ups. So as I've mentioned before, when substitutes warm up down the touch lines, it's almost just seen as a open the gate, close the gate, run back up. So my role is almost to ensure that they're being specific and deliberate with their warm ups, to ensure that if someone's coming back from a really bad hamstring injury, that when they go down the touch line, they're ensuring that their hamstring is getting enough of the attention and warm up, so that when the player comes on, they're feeling ready. But no, I would never sort of work directly with the medical team in sort of action to process whether they could have this amount of game time or whether they could be selected. That would all be between the gaffer, coaches, and the medical team themselves.
Sure, sure. I imagine. I hope there's some advice taken. Some advice. There's some collaboration. Some advice taken. And another just follow up question on that. Would you, if there's a hypothetical situation where you're losing 2-1 in the 75th minute, so still have 50 minutes to make an impact, and you have a star player. Let's say you have a star striker who scores 50% of all of your goal involvements of the club are on the shoulders of this one striker, and he's injured, but he's only a bit injured, so he's coming back from an injury, right? Would you be comfortable subbing that player on?
Again, it would come down to the medical department if they've sort of made their assumptions or if they've made their assumptions off the data and the tests that they do sort of in the training ground Monday to Friday, and he's registered, potentially a little bit of contact training and that sort of thing, then and they've okayed it, then absolutely, because you never want to put a player's career at risk, because like you just said, that they're people as well as players, so it's not just looking at it as a value, but it's looking at it as a person with qualities, and you would never want to put someone at risk who potentially could go and damage themselves further or risk their careers. So it would always be the medical team that sort of would confirm whether they're fit enough to play and how much they are ready to play. Whether it's that 10 minutes, like say, I'm a big FM player as well, and sometimes it tells you, you get 10 minutes out of a player, 20 minutes out of a player, and the medical team will do exactly that.
That's very insightful, as per usual. But I've got another question regarding the psychological aspect, because that's an aspect that I personally quite struggle with when it comes to, for example, scouting.
Yep.
So you are actually a mental health ambassador. How does that help your role as substitutions coach, or does it?
It probably doesn't help directly because I think they're on slightly different levels. It probably helps you. There's probably some transferable skills there. So, for example, as in my mental health role, I regularly talk to people who are struggling, and you observe them and sort of observe their behaviours and that sort of thing to really sort of evaluate where they're at, because sometimes it can be difficult for people to open up. Um, but I don't know. I think otherwise it's just a case of being supportive, being understanding, helping. Probably the biggest thing is being emotionally intelligent, being able to understand people's emotions, and knowing what to do with that information once you've had those conversations. That probably the biggest transferable skill between the two. Obviously on slightly different levels because they have different consequences. But I think that's probably, yeah. I think on reflection, that's probably the biggest. It's just being emotionally intelligent with how you react to those sort of people. Because, like you said, that well, like I just said as well, that they're people, not players. That you've got to just treat it as a person that's come to you with a problem.
Yeah, that's a really good, really good answer. I've questioned. I'm not sure if you can answer this, if this makes any sense, but it's a question I thought to ask anyway. There's a certain kind of aura about lone players, for example, lone players and kind of young players. If you have, for example, a lone player that's come in, and the young player in the same position that when you play the lone player instead of the young player, you're taking minutes away from the youth player and giving that to the lone player, but more importantly, that you're developing a player for a club that you then can't afford to buy long term. Does that impact your? Do you agree with that at all, or does that impact your decision making when it comes to substitutions?
I think it won't impact the decision of substitutions because ultimately the end goal is we, not me. So we need to ensure that the result is got for the team. Um, but probably on a personal level, it depends on the manager. Managers will probably favour having young players or having lone players. Again, like your old versus young question, both have strengths. So it's potentially about tailoring those strengths to suit the game. My personal philosophy is that I'd probably favour the young player because they're part of your club, and in 2 years' time, there's a chance that they could still be at your club, whereas the lonely player will come back. But I don't think there's any. I don't think there's too much in it really. I think it's just personal opinion really.
Yeah, you're right. I think it's personal opinion. It's mostly down to personal opinion, I think.
Mm,
But you mentioned the young players that will stay at your club. So there's a theory. Well, not a theory. It's widely assumed that players that come through the academy, for example, the young players that we mentioned before, they are, and and especially if they're from the area and they support the club, then they give more for the shirt, right? They put in more effort, or they work extra hard, or basically there's kind of it's almost like putting a fan's passion on the pitch, but
mm.
with a football player's quality. Do you agree with that sentiment? Do you think that can help in a substitutions context?
Um, Not directly, no, because I think if we've signed a player in order to be in our football club, then for me, I'm looking at his character. I think that's something that's really big because, just about every player can back foot receive in the game. So technically, there's real fine margins between players, but I'm looking at a character as probably a greater decider on whether a player comes into our club or not. And for me, if a player can run hard, which is something that I would expect, it'd be a non-negotiable. You know, whether they've come to the academy or they're a loanee, a free transfer, an older player signing, a younger player coming up. I think regardless of who and where they are, I think if they can work hard for you, be a sponge on the training ground, demand standards of their other players. I think that's the sort of character that I want in and around sort of my training ground. And regardless where them players come from, that's the criteria that we're going to recruit for.
That's fair enough. So, in your career so far, you've been a scout, an analyst, a coach, a mental health ambassador, and of course, a substitutions coach. If there's anything else, please correct me. But what do you see yourself doing in 10 years?
Yeah, so that's all my roles inside of football. I've done a lot of roles outside of football as well to fund the dream. Um, but I won't go through all those because we'll be here for the next hour. But in 10 years' time, I think I would love to be a gaffer. That's my sort of ultimate goal, probably as it is for many other young coaches around the world. It's the dream job. It's playing to win. It's having a team that can summarise your style of play and represent you on the pitch, and sort of being part of that squad, that real collective, that team cohesion, and the fantastic culture that comes with being in the dressing room, and the ability to sort of like impact lives as a gaffer. That's the sort of things that I really sort of enjoy. So that's the goal for me. Um, Everything I do is sort of trying to gear towards that, and make that become a reality, really.
You mentioned that's a great goal. I wish you all the best in making that happen. But
Yeah, thank you.
just a question to follow up on that. So many coaches have a playing philosophy. Other coaches are completely adaptable, and there's a debate as to how much a coach can should implement his philosophy and how much he should adapt to his players. Which I actually why don't I actually I'll incorporate that as well. So for two questions, do you have a playing philosophy? And on the debate as to whether you should be kind of authoritarian and say, okay, we're playing a 4-3-3, we're playing tiki taka, and anybody who doesn't want to or can't play the system, get out of the club. Or do you look at your players and say, okay, here's what I've got. I'm going to do the best that I can right now, and then eventually maybe build a philosophy.
Mm.
What way do you
Yeah,
go?
no, it's a good question, Jacob. I think in terms of the first question, have I got a playing philosophy? I would say yes, but I think it's still developing. I'm only 25 years of age, so I'm still sort of learning what I do and don't like. This probably last year has been the biggest learning curve for me in terms of pressing. I think I've just fell in love with it. It's something that I'm really passionate about. Looking at the different styles: ball orientated, zone orientated, man orientated. Um, Jesse Marsh coming to the Premier League has been fantastic to watch. So for me, I'm still developing my philosophy. I've got a basic understanding. I've got a few whiteboards in my room that sort of like consist of my ongoing playing style and game model. But I think the fact that I've been in at Wimbledon for a year, that affected my philosophy because I started to learn things in a little bit more depth and see things play out in front of my eyes, and I might have seen things I liked a little bit more to add to it. In terms of your second question, I think it's a great question. I think it's something that you could debate with in a pub over a pint for hours. I think it's one of football's sort of best debates, really. My personal opinion or my personal approach would probably be I would suit it to the players. I think there's so many dependent and variables that you have to consider in terms of like if you were at a non-league club or if you were at a team with a bigger budget. But I think in order to suit it to the players allows you to have greater success because you might not be in a position to bin off 10 players and get 10 more players in. So you by suiting your style to their needs, you can sort of be in the middle. And I don't think it has to be one or the other. It's about compromise. So you can sort of agree in the middle to have like a varied style.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think I would also, to some extent, build around the players. But I'm not a coach. I never will be. I've not got the temperament for that. But who do you? Many people have idols and people that they look up to. Do you have a coach or a few coaches that you'd have inspired you, and people who
Yeah,
you look
yeah,
up to?
yeah, absolutely, yeah. I throughout lockdown really it was tough. So I started sort of like projects around my favourite managers. So you're looking at like Bielsa, Jesse Marsh was one, Gasparini, Klopp and Pep are obviously obvious examples. But then also like on a probably not a global scale, you've got people like Paul Tisdale, who's at Exeter and did some great stuff with Team Bath. So there's a real sort of variety of managers who I like to learn from and base myself on because they've gone and done it. They've proved themselves. They've tried all these techniques. Robbo is now one. Going into it, I hadn't researched him too much, but having worked with him for a year, I think he's incredible. So he's another manager that you base yourself on. So yeah, I think I've probably got about 20 or 30 because I just think it's so important to open yourself up to as many managers as possible to try and take little bits from everyone and almost become a hybrid of it.
Yeah, that's the beautiful thing about football, in my opinion, that you can. There are so many people involved. You can take the best people. I think take the best kind of little nuggets of information from different
Mm,
people, and then mold that into a philosophy, mold that into a style of play, or for example, a recruitment strategy or whatever, and then that I think that could have the best effect.
mm.
Uh, how in terms of people who, for example, you've paved the way for substitutions coaches. Would you give what advice would you give to people who want to be a substitutions coach or want to get into coaching in the future?
It would be to really commit yourself to the process because I think some people do it half-heartedly and think that a career in football is easy. But I think it's almost like a lifestyle. It's a choice you have to make because it is unsociable hours and you have to commit to it. So I'd say make sure it's definitely something you want because it can take over your life. I'm very appreciative of an understanding family and girlfriend that allow me to commit to this sort of lifestyle. But secondly, to follow your dream, follow your passion. Don't always. Well, I think the best piece I could give is something I was told when I was 18 back at Bournemouth from Carl Robson, who was my old boss. He said you've got to be rejected 1,000 times in order to be successful, and that's something that stayed with me. And even now in my wardrobe, I've got a list of how many times I've been rejected, and it's every case I get one, I just put a line on it, and I just know that I'm one step closer to being successful. Because football is a little bit direct and a little bit harsh at times, and you have to put yourself out there, particularly in a role like this where it is innovative and a little bit out there. You have to put yourself out there. So I would say that. I think the other thing I would say is don't ever like close yourself off to anything. The other day I saw a comment on one of my articles saying whatever next, a water bottle coach. Sort of a bit of a gimme. But if a water bottle coach takes 3 points a season more, then why not look into a way that you can sort of navigate that role? So I would just say that. I would say be open minded, look at ways to try and improve and offer something that maybe clubs don't have, and yeah, be persistent, be relentless.
Yeah, that's a brilliant answer. I completely agree. I think any marginal gains that can be had should be had. And with that, unfortunately, it brings us to the end of the podcast. Sammy, it's been incredibly fascinating and insightful talking to you today. Thank you very much for coming on. Where can people find you?
So I'm not really on too much social media. So only LinkedIn really, and my name's Sammy Lander. So by all means, reach out to me and ask any questions and that sort of thing. But really appreciate coming on, Jacob. It's been a fantastic 45-minute chat of football. What I live for.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for listening. We will be back for another specialist in football very soon.